Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've already been introduced, I think very well by Kuyen, so thank you for that. And it's a pleasure to see a lot of old friends and to make some new ones. In this session, I'm going to be talking about the building effective foundations for performance budgeting. As Kuyen just mentioned, it's a reform that is not new. Program budgeting was introduced in the US in the 1960s, but I'd say it's been very widely adopted by OECD countries, certainly since the 1990s. And there's been a rapid increase in the adoption of performance budgeting around the world. And by 2018, when the OECD did its last comprehensive survey, all but 4 of the 34 OECD countries had some form of performance budgeting. They've often proved disappointing compared to the initial expectations, but despite struggling with it, countries that have initially adopted performance budgeting have persisted in their efforts, progressively modifying their approaches based on experience. Some countries now report, or a lot of countries now report considerable success with this approach. And the key to success is to develop a broader culture of performance and strong links between budgeting and other strategic processes within government, strategic planning, for example. Successful countries have also built a robust infrastructure to support the production and use of performance information. And we'll be talking about that, financial management information systems, performance information systems. This presentation, the organization of budget into programs is a fundamental building block of performance budgeting. That's the first thing you do, if you like, is to organize your budget into programs. And in this presentation, I'm going to try to summarize some of the lessons that have been learned through this long experience, focusing on the design of programs. In the first part, we'll take a bit of a step back and look at what I'd say some of the basic prerequisites for success, such as having a clear set of objectives. Then we'll look in more detail at the design of programs, and finally look at other enabling reforms that support the program and performance-based approach to budgeting. So, am I in control of you? So what decisions and actions need to be taken in advance of the introduction of performance budgeting that will shape the structure and content of budget programs? I think first is to be very clear about what the objectives are that you're trying to achieve. Why are you introducing program-based budgeting? What do you expect to get out of it? Now, I'd say there are 3 main kind of sets of benefits that people commonly refer to. First is improving transparency and accountability by making explicit the links between resource allocations and government goals and committing to measurable targets. So that's one set, kind of like the most basic approach to performance budgeting. Then there's better aligning resource allocation decisions with government-wide and institutional goals. So expenditure is justified on the basis of its contribution towards the higher level objectives of the government. Then going a stage further, a stage deeper, is improving public services through the active management of resources informed by performance data. So you're shifting the focus from control of line items and incremental spending increases towards control through objectives, and also at the same time devolving control of resources to the people responsible for managing these programs, financial resources and others. So a few lessons on the process of objective setting. I think when you're deciding what your objective should be, it's very important to consult other stakeholders who will be directly affected. This isn't just about the Ministry of Finance. You need to bring on board the centre of government. The legislature is a key stakeholder. Line ministries, of course, they're going to be doing most of the work on this. And then your National Audit Office, the Supreme Audit Institution. I think it's also important to anchor performance budgeting in legislation. This could be the organic budget law, it could be some subsidiary regulations, and it also needs to be supported by very detailed guidelines for officials accompanying that. And it's important to get endorsement from the political leadership. This should not be just a technocratic exercise. At least the Minister of Finance, and preferably it goes to a higher level than that to get official endorsement of this process. So what we see is a lot of countries have adopted what I call an evolutionary approach to performance budgeting. These are the three types of performance budgeting that are identified by the OECD. There's a very big difference in the amount of work you have to do to achieve presentational performance budgeting as compared to a managerial approach to performance budgeting, in terms of the extent of changes and investments required. Experience also suggests that it's important to balance effort and reward at each stage. So an overly ambitious or highly engineered approach at the beginning, if you're trying to get towards managerial performance budgeting, is more likely to result in initial failure and disappointment. So thinking about what results you can achieve early on is important to maintain the momentum of the reform. That's why, I mean, I was recently, a few years ago, I was in Greece as part of an IMF mission, and they decided to move to adopting presentational performance budgeting as the first stage of their reform efforts. So, and as you can see, OECD countries are very evenly divided in terms of where they are on this approach. Experience shows that to successfully implement PB, it's important that the new approach is supported by the organic budget law and or secondary legislation. Provisions would typically include a requirement to present the budget on a programmatic basis and to include a performance or strategy statement that links budget allocations explicitly to policy objectives. The addition of programs into the budget classification system is a basic step, but requires further detailing of structures below the program level, as well as consideration of how to capture objectives that link programs together, such as environmental sustainability, digitalization of government. A lot of government strategies include these cross-cutting objectives. So how to organize programs across ministries to support these higher level objectives. High quality guidance is very important to help both Ministry of Finance and line ministries define and cost programs and identify the right performance indicators. We'll get on to that. That's one of the biggest challenges. The links between strategic planning processes and the budget should also be clarified in the guidance or legislation. Governments produce a huge number of strategic documents. Which are the ones you should pay attention to in relation to performance budgeting? I'd also say a medium-term perspective in the budget is a basic starting point, or I would say a precondition for effective performance budgeting, because it provides line ministries with the parameters to plan programs and commit to meeting performance targets that relate to longer term strategic objectives, for example, covering the term of an administration. So here's I think, a good example of a piece of budget legislation encapsulating the objectives of performance budgeting. This is the New Zealand budget law. I'm not going to, this is an extract from it. I'm not going to, or a description of what it does. I'm not going to go through this in detail. You can read it in your own time, but I'm just going to point out a couple of points. It's saying part of the objective is to break down traditional silos to make the budget more responsive to the collective interests of the government, creating broader appropriations and devolving financial powers to improve the quality of service delivery, increasing executive accountability, and better informing the public and the Parliament about the objectives of spending and what it has achieved. Now, I think it's important to note that program structures should not normally be structured around the objectives set out in a national strategic plan. Strategic planning is fundamentally different in character to budgeting. Strategic planning asks, what resources do we need to achieve our goals? Budgeting, in contrast, asks, what is the best that we can achieve with the resources that we have? Strategies focus on change and are normally selective, reflecting the current concerns of the government. In contrast, the budget covers all of government's activities and provides continuity of support as well as changes at the margins. So government strategic planning frameworks do need to be tied into the budget process so that programs respond to government objectives and priorities. But how do you do that in the light of what I've said? I think, first of all, is to define a limited set of national and sectoral strategies with medium-term perspectives that are linked to the budget process. For example, a 5-year national development plan, if you have one, or the program of the administration that's just been elected. 3 to 5 year strategic plans for each ministry, and perhaps if you have it, a 5-year investment plan. This is where the bulk of the spending will be. And then budget programs must justify changes in expenditure based on their contributions towards national or sectoral strategies. So they need to explain, if they're proposing changes in expenditure, new programs, etc., how that contributes to these higher level objectives. So here's kind of like a flow chart I've drawn up of how these processes link to each other. On the left-hand side, you've got the planning processes that I've described. On the right-hand side, you've got the budgeting processes. Now, very often, strategies are prepared with no reference to the budget at all. So this defines, what the information flows also that you can look at between these two flows. So your national development plan is informed by the macroeconomic outlook for the government. So the government knows what kind of resources it's working with when developing its national development plan. The government's fiscal objectives flow through to the medium-term fiscal framework. That provides the parameters for medium-term planning and sectoral planning, etc. And then I'd also, over to the right, you can see, I think spending reviews are a very important tool, linking those levels together. So when the government's thinking about the period of its term of office, its 5-year development plan, the comprehensive spending review will free up the resources to direct to the rebalance across government between different programs, and within sectors, a more narrow spending review helps you again to make space for new programs and shifts in resources. So just to reiterate here, really, a medium-term fiscal framework is a very important building block for moving towards program budgeting. It supports the achievement of government economic and social objectives, and it maintains the overall fiscal credibility and manages fiscal risks, such as adherence to fiscal rules. Medium-term expenditure frameworks translate strategic priorities in the national plan into budget allocations, and it provides the parameters for program development. Once you've made a decision to introduce program-based budgeting, what new elements are introduced to the budget process? What are lessons that have been learned from other countries that are important? So programs, as I said before, are the foundation of performance budgeting. The organization of programs is generally the starting point. Programs, you could say, are an organized set of activities to achieve an objective. In budgetary terms, this involves regrouping expenditures, including capital and recurrent costs, and introducing a new type of classification into the budget. So programs are added to the system of budget classification along with sub-programs and a lower level, such as an activity, or also at a higher level, they can be grouped together as missions or policy areas. The terminology here is quite confusing because lots of people use different terminology to describe these different levels. Now, it's important that programs align with organizational responsibilities for different government functions and for the delivery of public services, public goods and services. So there has to be an accountable unit there that is responsible for delivering this program. But it's not the same as an administrative classification. So I think it's not right that every department of every ministry should have a program. It should force you to look at also your existing organization structure and say, is that how I want to be organized to deliver these objectives? So it's kind of an iterative process, I think, thinking about programs and organization structure in relation to each other. Also, programs should not be too numerous. I'd say, as a rule of thumb, each ministry and some countries have set a limit explicitly. You shouldn't have probably more than 5 to 7 programs per ministry. But of course, you can add sub-programs and activities covering their various areas of responsibility. So some ministries you might end up with 1 program, some you might end up with 7. It's a pragmatic decision. But the important thing is that programs should become the main focus of budget discussions rather than the line items. It doesn't mean that the line items, the economic classification, loses its importance, but it should be secondary. Once you've defined what your objectives are, aligned your resources, then you can talk about the detail of the budget. Flexibility, I think, is very important. We're going to be talking about a pragmatic approach. I think one lesson is don't overcomplicate program design by applying a rigid framework across the whole of government. Focus on the value added from performance-based budgeting. Avoid it becoming a make-work exercise. Not every ministry has to detail, has to have many performance objectives or detailed performance indicators for all of its objectives. It may have 1 program, it may have a series of activities under that program, it might not even have sub-programs. I think that particularly applies to policy ministries. The area where you really need to focus your attention, where the most value is in service delivery. You know, education, health, Ministry of Interior functions, things where you're directly interacting with the public, or where there's a lot of money being spent, for example, in infrastructure. So I think the key is to differentiate between different types of government business, and to have a framework, an analytical framework for doing this is also helpful. So I think differentiating between policy and regulatory functions, where the link between spending and outcomes is unclear or very indirect, and also entitlement programs and transfers, where probably, you know, the focus should be more on indicators of efficiency and effectiveness. You're not talking about major new programs. These are defined in law. The financing is driven by legal considerations and not by the government's strategy. So different approaches are required for different areas. That's helpful. So if you look, for example, at a ministry that primarily deals with policy and regulatory functions, look at the Ministry of Finance, for example. Typical programs would be macroeconomic management, a revenue management program, an expenditure management program, a program covering debt and balance sheet management, financial sector regulation and oversight. That would be a typical program structure. And then also probably an administrative support program. I think administrative support programs are very helpful. My own personal view is that every ministry should have an administrative support program that takes care of finance, HR, IT, these kind of issues, and they should all look the same so that you can compare across government departments and maybe achieve efficiency savings. See who's doing the best job. If you have the same structure, the same performance indicators, you can see who's doing a better job than somebody else. So I look here at one example from Australia, the Department of Treasury. They have one big program, Department of Treasury, with a set of activities under it. You could call these sub-programs, perhaps. They don't have sub-programs. So the one deals with policy analysis, another deals with government spending, one deals with markets and financial and taxation systems, one about the legislative program and regulatory functions. Then have another program dealing with international financial relations, one for markets and business, and one for intergovernmental finance. Looking a bit more at service delivery programs. These are programs that involve, I'd say, a direct interface between government and citizens through the delivery of basic public services. It might be public safety, health, education, clean water supply, roads, etc. These are often complex in their delivery structures, cascading through different levels of government. Such programs also generate large amounts of data that are useful for effective management of the services. And here, program structures should support more effective management and accountability for these programs. Another important characteristic of such programs is that they're often capital intensive, accounting for a very big part of government expenditure, and particularly the discretionary part of the expenditure. So programs in this area should support more effective management and accountability. So if we look at an example here, I'm taking one from Estonia. From there, here we see their program for internal security. They're using, again, this is an example of where they use different terminology. So they have a program, they have a set of activities supporting that program, and they also define services. separately. So here they're identifying an overall goal for that program. They've got a set of indicators that include a mix of effectiveness measures like response times, absolute numbers, injury and deaths, and also perception-based indicators. How effectively does the public think the ministry is performing its services? So this is one example. They've got 21 program activities under that program and 10 services in just one of those, supporting just one of those activities. So that's an example of quite a complex program structure in quite a complex area of government. Choosing performance indicators. I think this is one of the trickiest areas. What are the right performance indicators to use? The links between expenditure and outcomes are often unclear. Finance is only one factor amongst many that affect outcomes. So performance indicators should clearly respond to government's higher level objectives, but at the same time, they need to be smart, you know, specific, measurable, action-oriented, timely, and you also want them to present a balanced view of what the ministry is doing. So part of it should be about the results, part of it should be about the efficiency with which they deliver the results. But at the same time, measures need to be pragmatic. So they need to be measurable using readily available data and also data that is auditable. So you have to take all these factors into account when choosing your performance indicators. That's not an easy thing to do, and countries still struggle with it. It's all important also to limit the volume of performance indicators that you use in the budget document itself. Here it's important to distinguish between performance indicators that you're going to report to the public and your senior management. That's one set. But there's a lot of other information that you need to manage your business within a program or a ministry. So distinguishing between those things is important. You don't want to constrain, you don't want to say to the ministry, you can only have 10 performance indicators. Because if I'm running a detailed program, I need a lot of data and information. I don't want to be told that I can't have this. So but it's important to say for the budget document itself and the presentation of that, I'm not going to have very many performance indicators to communicate with the public, to communicate with my political bosses. So countries, when you look at budget documents, countries have tended to trend towards fewer indicators over time, trying to improve the quality. I'm going to talk here I mean, most countries start with a presentational form of performance budgeting. That's a good place to start, I think, where the main objective is to increase transparency and by implication accountability for the use of resources. Therefore, at the most basic level, a statement of performance objectives is provided linked to budget allocations, and that's incorporated into the budget document that's presented to the Parliament. And at the end of the year, the government, as part of the annual financial reporting process, produces a statement on the results achieved compared to those that were set out in the budget. In a more ambitious approach, accountability gets pushed down to the level of program managers, and then that's matched by the devolution of financial resources and managerial control. So you're moving in the direction of performance-informed budgeting and then managerial budgeting. And at the managerial level, you're talking about routine use of performance and budget information to manage programs during the year. This may involve structured discussions and the use of IT to generate dashboards to aid decision-making by senior executives. The US provides a good example of that type of a system. Okay, so that's kind of the bit about what programs should look like and why. I'm going to talk a little bit about the other important enabling measures that help this approach. As we said, performance budgeting tends to succeed when it's part of a broader shift to a culture of performance in government. So as Alan Schick noted in a publication when I was at the OECD, performance budgeting cannot be a standalone innovation. It must be closely aligned to national performance and medium-term expenditure frameworks and evidence-based assessment of policies and resources. Also, the systematic use of performance information needs to extend beyond the Ministry of Finance to involve line ministries, the legislature, and the Supreme Audit Institution. So enabling reforms include both PFM reforms, including capacity building, and broader efforts to change the orientation of all parts of government to be more performance oriented, including civil service and accountability institutions, the Parliament, and the Supreme Audit Institution to change their focus. So we've already talked a bit about these upstream reforms. I won't go for that again. Medium-term fiscal and budget frameworks. We discussed why those are important. Setting the parameters to plan for performance. Spending reviews, which free up budget resources to help you with the realignment of spending. Then I'll go into more detail now about these parallel reforms. Finance IT systems are very important to support this process. Systematic ex-ante evaluation of new spending programs linked to outcomes, and then PFM capacity building for line ministries. So turn to talk about finance IT a bit. IT systems, I would say, are really key to making program and performance-based budgeting work. They enable countries to move progressively from a simpler version towards performance-informed budgeting and data-driven program management. So what are the most important IT functions that need to be in place? What changes do governments typically make to bring them up to the right operational level? So including costing modules to enable governments to enable ministries to cost their programs, and budgeting modules integrated into the FMIS. That supports quality program design, getting the system to produce program-based reports. These are not the same as the traditional financial management reports. So you're talking about segmental reporting and the system being able to produce information in a digestible format for somebody who's a program manager. And also, you need to think about your business processes. Have your business processes evolved to support effective program implementation? If you're devolving control of resources to a lower level, do your business processes facilitate that? Often it gets, the implementation gets slowed down if you don't change your business processes. Then there's this whole issue of integration of financial and non-financial data. To make sense of your performance, you need to be able to relate it to the spending, but how do you do that? There's information coming from a wide range of different sources. Your national statistical reporting system, for example, and a lot of systems that are within line ministries. So countries that seem to have been relatively successful in this have, put information from the FMIS and information from many other systems into a big data lake, and then used kind of business intelligence type software, Tableau or something like that, to produce reports are used for decision making. So a couple of examples of this. I think Canada has done a very good job with its Treasury Board info-based system. The UK Treasury also has another system. It's not a financial management system, but it takes from all the financial management information systems that line ministries have and all this other data to produce these performance reports. So key IT systems development, budget module, costing module, financial reporting on a program basis, decision support systems, capture of performance information from multiple systems, and a performance reporting system integrating these different functions. So here's an example from Estonia of how they've structured their financial management information systems. They have an SAP system at the core of it, but they also have a cost accounting system. They have a separate budget planning and reporting system, structural and national funds management system. There are many different ways to organize. This is just, an interesting example. What doesn't show up very clearly on this slide, unfortunately, are the outputs from this: performance information reports, the budget dashboard, which is geared towards program managers. That's kind of over at the right. And then over on the left side, an open data portal so that the public and anyone else can look at these, the program performance. Data management and reporting becomes an important issue when you're trying to implement this type of system. If the FMIS is composed of separate integrated systems, all the systems must use the same data and classifications. A lot of work to be done there. It's important to include versioning capability in the system. You need to think about automatic controls, the budget limits, alignment of information in different systems, and whether the inserted information is coherent and correct. Constant training is needed in data analysis and data visualization to make this information useful and accessible. And also the systems need to meet the different reporting needs of multiple users. So for the MOF and the agencies that are implementing programs. And as we've said, a lot more information will typically be in the ministry's system than is in the MOF's system. So I'll talk very briefly about other public sector management processes. These are kind of a bit outside, our remit. But something certainly to think about is the strategic planning system. How can the Ministry of Finance, for example, influence that to make sure that strategic links are made between planning and budgeting at certain stages of the process? That flow chart I referred to earlier. And then, people often link performance-based management to the introduction of individual performance agreements. That would probably include people like program managers and performance-related pay. Although the evidence about whether performance-related pay works is mixed, to say the least. I think it can often actually have a negative effect on performance if if people's pay depends on it, they will typically lowball all the targets. So I don't think it's necessary. I wouldn't recommend it. Then there's this whole process of ex post evaluations of policies and projects. A lot of work to be done there so that you feed information back into the budgeting system about how effective programs have been. And then, of course, there's a lot of capacity building to be done in this whole area because it's a different type of different way of thinking about the budget. A lot more analysis required and not just thinking about money, but the relation of money to performance. So having an intervention logic, a logical framework for how your program works, that will give you a lot of the performance indicators you need. And you understand what contribution government is making, what contribution finance is making, and therefore what you should be measuring and paying attention to. So I think that's it from me. And a couple of references. The OECD good practices for performance budgeting is a good reference, and also the book that I co-authored with Don Moynihan on next generation performance budgeting. Thank you.